welcome back to another Women Empowerment Show. My name is Jessie Taken Alive-Rencountre. I'm your host for the Women Empowerment Show here on Social Distance Powwow. The reason why we started this Women Empowerment Show was to be able to bring forth and highlight a lot of our Indigenous women throughout Turtle Island. Indigenous women that are doing important work in their communities, that are helping through healing, sharing their gifts and such. And tonight we have two wonderful guests, two matriarchs in their communities, but amongst their people and such. And we're going to be following up. This is the second episode from a previous episode where we were going to be talking about trauma. And a lot of people get a little scared when we say that word of trauma, but I think this conversation and how these two wonderful matriarchs share this is very helpful, is very light, it's very educational. We just do want you to realize though too, that sometimes speaking about and hearing about some of this topic that we're going to be discussing might bring up some feelings, but also it's also very important. And we also talk a little bit about, or we will be talking a little bit about how we heal from this and the importance of healing from this. So I'm your host. Stay tuned for this wonderful episode coming up. I'm Betty Washday, Chante Washe na Betchu Zapi, Wechach Betumpi Wina, Jessie Taken Alive-Rencountre in Machiapi. Good day, relatives. My Lakota name is Wechach Betumpi, which means woman who is born from the stars. My English name is Jessie Taken Alive-Rencountre. I'm a Hunkpapa Lakota from the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. I'm the host of the Women Empowerment Show here on Social Distance Powwow, and we are excited to come back for another episode with two amazing women, a follow-up conversation that was important, that was vital for a lot of people, not just our Indigenous people, but people in general, about the, understanding a little bit about what trauma is and how it affects us. So this is, some sensitive topics that we might be talking about, but also it's very vital. It's very important that we're able to bring this up, because this is going to help us lead to healing as a whole, as not just an individual people, but as a whole. I am joined to you by two amazing women, two matriarchs of their different tribes. And I'm going to introduce our first guest with us tonight, who is joining us again for another episode, episode number 2. I'm going to introduce you to my first guest, Katsi Cook, and I'll let her do her own introduction. Maybe she wants to share something in her own language, maybe share a little bit about herself, and then I'll introduce our second guest. So good evening, good day, Katsi. How are you?
It's going good, Jessie. I'm so happy to be here. Hihaniwash Day back to you. Sego Sewa Guego. Hello, everyone. My name is Katsi Cook. I'm a Wolf Clan Mohawk from the Akwesasne Mohawk community here at the U.S.-Canadian border. Our community is trisected by southwestern Quebec, southeastern Ontario, and far north New York State. And so we live at the 45th parallel, and I'm happy to visit with you this evening. These concepts, this conversation we're about to have is for the purpose of getting well, of feeling better, of trusting ourselves and our abilities, our intuitions, so that we can continue to strengthen ourselves, our family, our community. And so I brought forward to the Spirit Aligned Leadership Program a wonderful relative here at Akwesasne, who I will introduce in a moment. But I just wanted to preface this evening with you with a few words about why the Spirit Aligned Leadership Program focuses on healing. Our mission is to elevate the lives, the stories, and the visions of Indigenous women elders of North America. And so you can find stories of these elders at our website at spiritalign.org. And as we read the applications of our elder women, the average age of which is 72 so far. Uh, we hear and read their stories of being in residential school, of coming of age at a time of great crisis in our communities, of poverty, of being taken from the breast of their families, of losing language, of losing a sense of connectedness to kinship. And so, in these stories that you can find on our website are elders such as Pauline Waterfall, who talks about being taken to residential school and not returning home for 15 years, and that she participated in the renewal of the potlatch system in her community in British Columbia after it was banned for 66 years. And her work was to reclaim and determine her own identity. And so these ruptures, these, even in Jessie's name, we were taken alive outside of our own context, our cultural worlds, our universes, and put in a foreign man's environment. And so the work of healing is to situate ourselves back into our indigeneity, our relationships, our capacity for reciprocity, our ability to connect with the reality that the world is alive to us and that healing is possible. And so I know that many in the audience, in our communities, we understand big burdens of guilt and shame that is being carried in the bodies of women. And so I just wanted to begin by saying that guilt and shame is a common human response of our nervous system that evolved to protect us. So the goal can't be to rid oneself of guilt and shame. Our curiosity should be, how is persistent guilt and shame helping an individual to survive? We look for safety and protection, uh, and that's what drives this feeling of permanent guilt that formed when we were injured as youth. And we continue to carry this traumatic injury in our spirits. And we hold tightly to the part of ourselves that holds feelings of persistent guilt. This is hard work. It's exhausting as guilt and shame become an inhibiting force in our lives, showing up in our relationship patterns as not wanting to be seen or to be known. We can't unring the bell of our childhood traumas, but we can find a pathway to make new meaning and deepening our understanding of ourselves and others. And so, in that spirit, I'm thrilled to introduce to you my sister cousin, Chief Beverly Cook, a family nurse practitioner who served our community for over 30 years. And she is a brilliant practitioner of our spiritual ways. Um, as Jessie said, a matriarch in our community. She's a ceremonial matriarch, a political matriarch, and my sister cousin. Beverly.
Yawagaji, Sego Zewaguego, Yahuita Young Yets, Wagata Huni. I'm Wolf Clan, Mohawk woman. My Mohawk name is Gehoito. It means that she brought it with her. My English name is Beverly Cook. I'm a family nurse practitioner. I'm a registered nurse. I'm an elected chief right now, and a mother and a grandmother. And I'm also very passionate about how our people need to be understood, and firstly being understood by each other. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a background. My oldest daughter is a tribal police officer. She's a detective sergeant, and she deals with crimes against our women and children. And several years ago, she was working with women who had been harmed, who had been raped and um, physically abused, and was having a difficult time taking them to the hospital and feeling confident that the women were being treated the way that she felt that they should be. So she had asked me if, while I was still working at the clinic, if I would become a sexual assault nurse examiner so that she could bring these women to me, and she would know that they would be treated with all the love and support that they needed at the time. So in order to do that, you have to take a course, and you have to be preceptored. You have to train under someone for a while. But part of that training was an introduction to the adverse childhood experiences study. And the whole point of us learning about this was to understand where women were coming from, what their backgrounds were, how being judgmental about them was not fair. It wasn't correct, and to be able to work with them. So I had no idea where this was going to take me, but it really the road has been really long in learning about this, and having to do my own healing, having to do my own introspection. So this adverse childhood experience study tells us many things, that trauma, the experiences of trauma are many. And Gaji ran through some of those, introduced that topic at the beginning of this session. This study speaks directly to physical and emotional and sexual abuse, also emotional and physical neglect. It also takes into consideration those of us who have lived with family members with mental illness, or family members who have succeeded in committing suicide, family members who have alcoholism, or where there is drug abuse in the home. Some of us deal with family violence, seeing our mother battered, or we have an incarcerated family member, or maybe our parents have separated or divorced. So these were the categories in this study, and there were two physicians. One was from San Diego, one was from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they collaborated to find out what the effects were of these types of childhood traumas. And they looked specifically at the period from birth to the age of 18. Mm-hmm. And then they followed individuals in this study from the average age of the people in the study was around 50 years old. And they followed them for several years. And I think that some of them are still being followed now. But they administered a questionnaire, and they administered it to people who were attending a clinic at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, and it's where people go to get their regular health care done. So they asked specific questions about physical abuse and emotional abuse, about whether people had been hit or punched or slapped or had their hair pulled and so on. Very specific about the types of emotional abuse that someone might have suffered with their parents, being called down, being called names, being ignored, or if they had been sexually abused. And they also included emotional and physical neglect as well in the questionnaires. Did they feel like anybody cared about them? Did they feel like they were important? Did they feel like they had enough food to eat or clean clothes to wear? And so on. So the questions were quite stirring. And for each category, there were 10 categories in all in the questionnaire. For each question, if that had indeed happened to you, then you would score a 1. And of course, if it didn't happen to you, then it was 0. But they added up all of the positive answers, all of the yeses, and that would be your A score. So if 2 of those things happened to you, then your A score would be 2. If 8 of those things happened to you in your childhood, then your A score would be 8. What they found in the study and what they were able to prove was that the more ACEs that you experienced in your childhood, the higher percentage, the bigger the chance that you would have other issues, health and wellness issues later on in life. But one of the things that I think that's important to understand about the study is that these were upper middle class people that participated in this study. They were college graduates and professionals. And in the results, they found that 28% of the participants in this upper middle class echelon of their patients had experienced physical abuse, and 22% of them had experienced sexual abuse. And in a similar study that was done among tribes in the Southwest, there were 7 tribes that they administered the ACE study to. The scores were 10 to 15% higher than this body of people that were in this study. So it was quite remarkable. And it made you feel that everything you knew about the hardships that your people were enduring was for real, that it wasn't a weakness of character, that it wasn't some kind of genetic mistake. It wasn't anything like that. The things that kind of get fed into your mind during your lifetime, but that it was something real that was happening. And I spoke about some of the mechanisms that how trauma can affect our physical being, how it can affect our brain development, and so on. So it all feeds together. But these abuses and these dysfunctions in our homes have actual impacts that we carry all our lives into our adulthood. And part of it, or a lot of the effects that we experience later on in our life, are because of what we experienced in our childhood. So I don't have, you're going to have to believe me when I tell you that the higher a person's ACE score, the more emotional and physical issues they're going to have later in life. And there's a way to think about it. If you can imagine a pyramid, and at the base of the pyramid is all of the adverse childhood experiences that somebody might have had. So it could be that the father was alcoholic. It could be that the mother was regularly beaten when the father was drinking, or the children were beaten, and everything that comes with that, the alcoholism in the home, and so on. Then you have to think about, how does that kind of an atmosphere or an environment in the home going to affect the development of the children who are living in that kind of an environment? How is it going to affect their personality? How is it going to change the way that they perceive the people in their lives, where in a home where everybody should be safe and who should be protecting them are the very people that they're afraid of? What does that do to the way that your personality is developing, and the way that you're bonding or trusting your parents? So there's disrupted neurodevelopment that I believe we talked about in our last session. With that happening to you, there's going to be difficulty in the way that you relate to people, the way that you relate to your teachers at school, the way you relate to the kids in the neighborhood or older kids. You're going to maybe have trouble learning or having trouble with memory. There's all kinds of social and emotional issues that come about when your neurodevelopment has been affected, that like we already said. And feeling that way, feeling, people start to feel like I'm not, I'm not pretty enough. That's why I'm having a hard time in my life. I'm not thin enough. I'm not dark enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not talented. I can't do things like my cousins do. And you start to feel bad about yourself. You, whatever pain, whatever trauma has happened to you at home, and you want to forget about it, you don't want to think about the things that have happened to you, you start to pick up ways of soothing yourself. You start to pick up ways of making yourself feel better. And the simplest ways are things that your friends introduce to you because they've probably already been there, especially maybe your older cousins, or maybe your older brothers and sisters are going to offer you a cigarette and say, here, smoke this. This is going to make you feel better. And besides, it'll give you something to do. And what we know is that the nicotine itself has potent anti-anxiety properties. That's why people like tobacco. That's why they use tobacco the way they do. That's why they, once they start smoking, sometimes people get addicted to the nicotine. And so then there's alcohol, and then there's other drugs that people use to help them feel better. And there's also chocolate, and there's also pasta. There's things that we eat that help us to feel better, or the way that we behave. Sometimes having many sexual partners, or having sexual partners at a really early age, is something that helps to make us feel better. It makes us feel like we're attractive. It makes us feel like we're wanted. It makes us feel like we're loved. And so we seek out people to be with and to have sex with, and that makes us feel better. But with all of those behaviors, drugging and drinking and smoking, as a temporary fix for the way that we feel about ourselves, about the way we feel about others, sometimes carries with it a burden of disease. And so having many sexual partners, we may end up with an STD, or with HIV, or with hepatitis B, or some other sexually transmitted disease, or from smoking from the age of 10. We end up with lung disease, with emphysema, or lung cancer, and so on, or drinking alcohol, becoming alcoholic, and we lose our families, we lose our kids, we lose our jobs. And there's consequences that come with that need to be able to make ourselves feel better, because nothing else does. We often don't feel that we can trust people. We're not at ease in our relationships. So there's a mountain of things that can go wrong. And we're not even talking about kids that end up in foster care. We're not even talking about people that have been to boarding school. We're not talking about people that have been disenrolled or rejected from their communities. There's just, the list is really long about how the things that can make us feel disconnected, and a feeling of not belonging anywhere. And so we set about to try to make ourselves feel better about that. And another consequence of all of that is early death. And so we might find a lot of our people, especially ones that struggle with alcohol and drugs, and then end up with other, like cirrhosis of the liver or some other disease, end up dying very early, like in their 60s, as opposed to in their 70s or 80s. So many of our reservations, our communities, our lifespan is much shorter. And so this is like super, super depressing. super sad, and we can get very angry about it because of all the other things historically that have happened to us. But so we realize that while a person is making their way through this this life of adversity, that very often they have kids that either they're raising or maybe they're not raising. Maybe it's kids that they left behind, that now that's their adverse childhood experience. So the cycle goes on and on until we put a stop to it. And where do we intervene? Where do we jump in to somebody's life to make a difference so that they don't have to feel this way? They don't have to end up feeling alone and that all they have is some kind of drug or some kind of behavior that's going to help them feel better. So those are some of the things that our people deal with that then put them in situations that are not safe and dangerous. And then you have people that are just minding their own business that bad things happen to. But it's an atmosphere, and it's a struggle that we see in a certain sector of every one of our communities, and we can't get away from it. And so inside, we carry this pain, and sometimes we don't know what to do with it. Now, when you think about women and what women are going through in their lives, I had read an interesting piece. I think it was Dr. Gabor Mate he was talking about when we start to teach people to say not to say no. And so our little 2-year-olds that are learning that they're autonomous and that they have a body and that they can have control, or they think they can have control over their body, and they learn to say no, or they don't want to eat something. We want them to eat it, and they say no. And so we call it the terrible twos, and we set about teaching them that it's not nice to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to think about, where does that get us later on in life when we're not allowed to say no? We don't think we have the right over our body, over the way we birth our children, over the way we raise our children, over the way, the language that we want to speak. And how long has that been going on with our people in general? So the ACE study just kind of brings that all home and demonstrates that, yes, these things, these traumas, these adversities that we face do have an effect on our health across our lifespan. It does account for our lower life expectancy than every other nationality in the United States, and so on and so forth, like that. So I don't know if you have any comment, Gudgy, or question about that.
Thank you, Beverly. Nyaukoa. This is very liberating information, just the way you delivered it. I know that you and I together went to a Women in Addictions conference in the 1980s with Patrick Carnes, who is the author of many books on addictions. One book, some don't call it love. It takes more than one training, more than one workshop. It's a pursuit to well-being, to healing, so that once you arrive at that self-introspection, that self-understanding, it's a powerful feeling. That's what women's empowerment is about, to be able to reflect with good information on our own life, insults, injuries, including that of our maternal line, that we carry these things in our bodies, in our behaviors, into our relationships. So these things you're sharing are very powerful and necessary for our women and our men to comprehend, to understand, and to continue to seek more information, more knowledge. We heal in relationships, and we know that once we achieve that moment where life isn't so heavy, things are a little better, I'm better prepared to support others in their healing journey. That healing happens in relationships. And we find those relationships, like many of our legacy leaders who went to residential school have, in doing that work of liberating their spirits from these traumatic injuries. And they're the ones who rebuilt the ceremonies, rebuilt the kinship and genealogical records of our communities. When we're spending all our time defending against the impacts of these childhood adversities, uh, and instead of reenacting them with the next generation, we can be more thoughtful, more mindful, more uh, able to work towards the decolonization that we hear so much about, because the first colonization occurred in our minds and in our spirits. And so this information you're sharing is so critical. And I know, Beverly, that you worked in the clinic to redesign how prenatal care is delivered, for example. We know that in many of our communities, many young pregnant women don't go to prenatal care at all. Um, but could you tell us a bit about this centering model that you work to bring to the clinic and the power it has for young pregnant women?
Yes, our clinic had the same prenatal model that every other conventional doctor's office had, where you sit in the waiting room for an unknown amount of time. You wait for the nurse to bring you in. She takes your blood pressure, listens to the baby's heartbeat, asks you how you feel, and you might have a short conversation. She has to leave. The doctor comes in and spends, on the average, 3 minutes with a pregnant woman and then leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so this centering pregnancy model that we became acquainted with brings women together of the same gestational age. They're all due to have their babies around the same time. Brings them into a circle and has them take ownership of their care. So what that means is that they have one of those um, blood pressure cuffs that wraps around their wrist, where they can take their own blood pressure and chart it in a flow sheet. And they take their own weight and they mark it in a flow sheet. Um, they see a midwife or a physician, either one, will be off in a corner of the room, and they'll have like a massage table, or sometimes they just have a mat on the floor, and they measure the mom's belly, and they mark it in their chart, and then ask them, how things are going. And in that conversation, the provider will say, okay, well, let's take that problem to the circle, to the group, and we'll see if anybody else is experiencing something similar and see what they're doing about it. And it could be swollen feet, or it could be, lots of heartburn, or something simple. And it could be something as dire as, my boyfriend beat me up last night, or he came home drunk again, or some other kind of anxiety that they're having.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the idea was to bring them together to be able to help one another, as opposed to one provider talking to them for 3 minutes. And if they were lucky, they would have a midwife who would spend a little bit more time. But the importance was the relationship of the women and the bonding of the women together. And it goes back to our old ways, our really ancient ways of the women being collectively together, connected to one another, um, mostly through kinship, watching their sisters be pregnant, watching their older sisters give birth, nurse their babies, raise their children, have a relationship, and how to do that. They were in close proximity to one another. In our ways, they lived in one big longhouse. Um, so there would be a family of a mother and a grandmother and daughters in this one home, and the men would come to their home, would come to their longhouse to live, so that the women had the power and authority in that home. So there wasn't abuse happening because the aunts are standing nearby, and so this was similar. It was very, very similar to that, where these women could find out from one another what worked and what didn't. And those relationships were really strong. And one of the worries that I had about bringing that kind of prenatal care model um, was that confidentiality was going to be an issue, and that these women, these young girls, these young mothers might be out in the community talking about what they heard inside of the circle. And for the 4 years that I ran that program, there wasn't not one single episode of anybody complaining that they had heard something that they had shared with the group out in the community, which just spoke to the respect and the care that grew between the women. And this type of a model um, was not something that they wanted to do. It wasn't something that they were used to. They resisted it. They didn't want to be in a group. They didn't want anybody knowing their business. But once they sat and talked with one another, it it worked well. Some of the women would talk about it wasn't their first babies. It could have been their second or third or fourth pregnancies. And it was interesting to hear them talking to each other about, I had a C-section. I want to have a natural birth this time. And having the other young women ask them, well, why did you have a C-section? And some of them said, well, my baby was too big, or I went way past my due date. But a number of the women would say, I'm not really sure why I had a C-section. The doctor told me I had to. I wasn't made, or I wasn't dilating enough. But she didn't know um, whether she had been in labor too long or if there was actually some kind of an issue. So having that be her body and her baby, and not having that information to be able to make a decision, it's chronic. It's a chronic problem, and it's part of our um, that teaching that we get when we're little, where we can't say no, where we can't ask, the questions about our own bodies, where um, we don't feel that we have that authority. And that's generations and generations of being taught that way, where women lose their children, to be taken away to boarding school, or they lose their children to a foster care program that doesn't understand um, how families work in our communities, that the aunties do take care of the babies, that in our culture, the word for mother and the word for auntie is the same word. And outside agencies wouldn't understand that. They would say all her kids are with their sister. Well, of course they are. If she's not able to take care of them, that's where they should be. But it wasn't understood. So kids were removed, and they were put into foster care, or they were sent away to boarding school in the older days. But that kind of relationship building, connectedness between the women was the most important thing. And many of the women that took part in that program are still close. They still know when each other's children's birthdays are, and the kids are close. So we start to undo all of those things that were done to us. We start to undo that. We start to make a difference and take control over how we birth our children, how we raise our children, how we educate our children. Just like the Freedom School, the Akwesasne Freedom School, which is a total Mohawk immersion school that was built from the ground up out of a crisis, and parents came together and took control of what we were going to teach our children, our own history, our own language, our own ceremonies. And that school's been in existence for 40 years now with nothing, but the will of the mothers to educate their children like that. So individually and collectively, our healing can't, sometimes our people will do marches, like we're going to do a healing march. And so you do that march, but it's the individual's experience within that event, within that march, that causes the healing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what blooms out into a community healing or a family healing, and then our people healing as a whole. We're not going to heal as a whole until that individual work is done with each one. It's like going to a teepee ceremony. Everybody's in that circle. Everybody's in that same ceremony, but it's each individual's experience inside of that brings a healing about by the morning time, or in a Sundance, or in a sweat lodge. It's all done together. It's a connectedness, but it's the individual piece, the individual healing that gets us better.
I'm going to jump in here a little bit. Thank you, ladies. You guys are both so wise and so full of wisdom. It's like I want to be able to grasp as much wisdom and knowledge from both of you. I think all of us do, those of us who are honored to listen to this. I want to go back a little bit to the trauma. And I think you kind of started to answer my question already about the healing aspect of it, about how we do that healing. But I think, you just said part of it was that a major part of it was being able to do that healing individually, and do our part, that we're all responsible for doing that healing. Talking about the ACE study that you had talked about earlier, if an individual who's listening to this episode here, if they want to do that ACE study, is that something that they can find online, just to kind of find, like, if they're curious to find out what their ACE study score would be? Is that something they can do online?
Yes, you can. You can go to the cdc.gov, and they have the ACE questionnaire. They have the questions online. But if you Google the ACE study, you'll come up with multiple sites that talk about childhood trauma and how that affects everybody throughout their lifetime. And you'll find the questionnaire as well. And it's I don't know, something you can do with a friend, or you can do it alone. And I know that when I did it, I had to think about it, because you rationalize a lot of things. You say, oh, that's just the way that they were, or that's the way everybody's mother was, or that's the way everybody's father was. Everybody's father drank. Well, not everybody's.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody's, or when you're until you really take a look at what your childhood was,
Mm-hmm.
you think it was normal. You really think it was normal until you start to, read, or to find out that this is trauma. These things happen to everybody, just about. Maybe not all in the same numbers, but those types of experiences happen to many of us, but we didn't know, what the impacts of it were. We just toughened up. And that's the other thing, like when they say, that we toughen up, we automatically, our body becomes rigid. When we're confronted with something, there's a posture. When we're threatened, there's a posture that we get into, and it's to protect our inner organs. And you can see it in boxers and fighters, their shoulders round and their rib cage kind of pulls in, and it's a protective stance. And when we're hurt, our body also starts to clamp down, to hold down. What do you do when you're hurt and you try not to cry? Or your parents say, don't you even cry. I'll give you something to cry about. That, you're choking it down, and you're choking it, and you're pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And that accumulates after a while, right? And then when something happens, like those children that were found at the boarding schools where their bodies were found, and there was this explosion of rage. I mean, it's appropriate to have rage, but it's also fueled by all of that pent up rage individually.
Mm-hmm.
So that some people did act out, some people did just like could not get a handle on that. And I think that's an opportunity where you turn around and you look at what that was. What is that that's coming out of me, and where did it come from? And yes, it's about the boarding schools, it's about those children, but that same experience maybe on a smaller level happened to you too. Those loss of attachments
Mm-hmm.
to safe people, loving people in your home. That, because we don't know what each other's experience is. It could be getting swept off to foster care, or losing someone that you really care about, a mother or father, that walks out on the family or dies, or whatever happens. Those things bubble up after a while.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, to say that collective trauma is all of our individual pain and hurt.
Right. It's almost like thinking about it, the connection. There's more of almost like a metaphor. Like, yes, they dug up or the children, but also that dug up a lot of issues in our people as well too. They unearthed that, and it's almost like it's sad that happened, and it's good that people are learning about it, but also on an individual basis for a lot of us, it's almost like it's sad that that's happened, but it's important for us to feel that, to heal and stuff. And when you think about it in that way, it's like, oh my gosh, this is important. It's
Mhm.
angry, but we have to heal, right? I want to go back to the whole part about healing, because I know you kind of start mentioning it, and when I was listening to you, this thought came to me as I was listening to both of you about healing and such. But the thought kept coming of return back to our ways. The answers are there, and you were talking about your prenatal clinic and the practice that you guys were doing there. That's exactly what you guys were doing, was going back to our original ways. And I always feel like um, that our answers to the trauma and the pain that we carry are within our cultural ways, the many different beautiful teachings and stories and ceremonies that we have. And so when an individual is learning more about healing as an Indigenous person, it's like, let's go back to our culture. Let's get into that sweat lodge or Sundance or whatever it might be, the ceremonies that are happening in the longhouses, because that also is in our DNA as well too. And that's how we can reset that. So, and that's what kept coming to me. And that thought came, and then you spoke about it, and I was like, yes, you just verified it. So,
Yeah.
Gaji, do you want to add anything as well too to this conversation?
Oh, there are so many stories that would take another hour, which we don't have. But I thank you, Jessie, for making this space available through your wonderful work. and I would ask your audience through you, do they want to continue this conversation? There are many quivers in our many arrows in our having to do with many years of work together of a group of women that we call Gunungwe, from which many beautiful songs were born through the work of the women. And since this is Women's Empowerment Hour, this is how women restore their power. I think of our Oharlogo rites of passage that arose out of the women recovering who they are, recovering their intuitive way of being together and being inside of their own self. And so I would like to carry this conversation forward to engage the audience more intimately. And so I would like you to reach out to your audience at some point somehow to see if they would like to continue this kind of conversation. Thank you, Jessie.
Yes, thank you. It's been an honor to hold this space virtually with both of you. You guys are both so powerful as far as with your matriarchal energy that you carried. I can feel it through, virtually, and it's amazing. And I just, it's like your adopted aunties that I want to continue to learn from. And so, I think it's an important thing. And the reason why we started this women empowerment show is the need for more women to be present. And I think a lot of people realize that it's the women that are the matriarchs that bring our families together, that bring our communities together. And that ultimately, we're the ones that can start that healing because we're the mothers and we're the grandmothers that can teach our children and our grandchildren. So, and the aunties as well too. But I want to say Wopila, which means a big thank you, and extend a huge thank you to both of you for sharing the wonderful wisdom that you guys both shared tonight. And I think so many people's lives are going to be impacted from this in a positive way just by you guys sharing your knowledge with us tonight. So again, Pilamaye Wopila, for your time, for your wisdom as well too. So I hope that we can continue this conversation for at least maybe one more episode because it's so important as well too. So
can I say just one thing before we close? Yes. When we talk about the ACE study and all of the adversity, and then all of the other adversities that we can think of that aren't in that list, that one of the keys to the resilience of ourselves and our children is a loving adult that swoops in and makes sure that child still feels that warmth and that attachment. It's usually a grandma. I mean, there's some mean grandmas out there, but it's usually the grandma that comes in and by that time has learned that this child just needs to be loved. And it's the same thing with, with somebody that's in addiction or in recovery. That's all the search is for love. And that's the antidote to all of these things. That's why our ceremonies work. That's why the ways that we instinctively know work, because we're built for that. We're built for connection. We're built for attachment. That we need that to live. And so I just wanted to say that to end it on a positive note, that we endure these things and we've seen it, our people through generations, but that's what keeps us going.
That is very powerful and beautiful, simple but powerful, right? And when you say that, I think like a lot of people might say, well, I didn't have that growing up, but there's always that saying of like, be that person that you wish you had when you were younger, right? Because you get that reciprocated back to you as well.
Exactly.
So, wow, beautiful closing. Again, Pilamaye, Beverly, Pilamaye, Gaji, for your beautiful words of wisdom, for your teaching, your knowledge, and your time as well too. So.
Thanks.
Doksha Ake Wachi Day. So thank you again, audience, for joining us for another wonderful show for our Women Empowerment Hour here with Social Distance Powwow. As you can see, we have important, beautiful topics with wise women like we have tonight. I encourage you to continue to join us for our Women Empowerment Hour. And so with that, I will see you next time. Doksha Ake.
Onegiwahe.
Ona.
I want to say thank you again for joining us for this wonderful episode, this powerful episode that we just witnessed with two amazing matriarchs in their community discussing and talking about trauma, how it impacts us, the importance of us healing from it, the importance of us all taking our part in healing our people, healing people everywhere. And also, if you have questions or comments that you would like to share, please don't hesitate to put those in that comment box below. We will try our best to make sure that we are able to get these questions or these comments to Beverly and to Gaji as well too. With that, I want to say Doksha Ake Wachi Day, which means we will all see each other again. Until next time. Thank you.